The day began like any other, with the faint hum of the city outside and the soft golden light spilling into the small apartment where she lived. She moved quietly around the space, careful not to wake her younger sibling, who was still asleep in the next room. The apartment was modest, with worn wooden floors and walls that had seen better days, but it carried a warmth that made it feel like home. She always appreciated the simple things: sunlight on the window, the aroma of coffee brewing, and the quiet moments before the chaos of the day began. Her life was a rhythm of routines. She worked part-time at a music academy, not as a student, but in the background, making sure the halls were clean, the instruments polished, and the rooms ready for lessons. It wasn't glamorous work, and she often went unnoticed, but it was honest, and it allowed her to be close to something she loved: music. Every day, as she swept the floors or dusted the grand pianos, she imagined herself playing. Her fingers would hover over invisible keys, and she would feel the music flow through her, soft yet powerful, though no one would ever see it. She had grown up with music as a quiet companion. Her parents had loved it, but they never had the means to provide lessons or instruments. Still, she learned by listening, peeking into music schools, watching people play in public spaces, and practicing on any piano she could access. She knew she wasn't trained in the conventional sense, but her ears had become sharp, and her fingers surprisingly agile. Music was her private world, a sanctuary where she could escape the noise and the judgment of everyday life. That morning, as she finished her small breakfast, a letter lay on the kitchen table, slightly crumpled, as though it had been pushed through the mail slot in a hurry. She picked it up carefully, her fingers brushing against the smooth paper. The envelope was from the academy she worked at, which was unusual. Most communications were routine memos or cleaning schedules. This felt different. She tore it open and unfolded the letter. Her eyes skimmed over the neat handwriting, and she felt a strange flutter in her chest. The letter invited her to attend a special recital event at the academy that evening. She was not to perform, only to help prepare the hall, but there was something about the wording that made her heart race. The event promised an audience that included notable teachers, students, and guests. A gathering of people who appreciated talent and music. She read the letter again, almost to make sure it was really addressed to her. She felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had never attended such events, let alone in the company of accomplished musicians and people of influence in the music world. It was a world she had always observed from the sidelines, one that seemed distant and unattainable. And now she was being asked to step into it, even if just in a small way. She wondered if it was a mistake, a mix-up that would be corrected before the day ended. Yet the letter remained in her hands, real and inviting. By mid-afternoon, she was on her way to the academy. The streets buzzed with life, and she walked with a steady pace, her mind a whirl of thoughts. She imagined the hall, grand and polished, filled with people dressed in elegant clothing, all gathered to celebrate music. She imagined the sound of pianos, violins, and soft applause echoing through the room. It was a scene that made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with anticipation. She had dreamed of this, but always as a spectator, never as someone who belonged there. When she arrived, the academy was alive with activity. Staff moved quickly, arranging chairs, polishing instruments, and checking every detail of the lighting and decor. The air was rich with the scent of fresh flowers and polished wood. She slipped into her role seamlessly, moving quietly among the staff, placing chairs, adjusting stands, and making sure every corner of the hall reflected perfection. She noticed the grand piano at the center of the stage, its black surface gleaming under the soft lights. Her fingers itched to touch the keys, to feel the cool surface under her fingertips, but she reminded herself of her place. Today, she was here to prepare, not perform. As she worked, she felt the eyes of some students on her, though they tried to hide it with polite smiles. She caught snippets of their whispers, curious, slightly dismissive, and sometimes mocking. Some of them had known her only as the quiet girl who cleaned the halls. They seemed to find it amusing that she was here, among them, in the midst of a world that often judged by appearances and pedigree. She felt a small sting, but brushed it aside. She had learned long ago that people's judgments were their own burden, not hers. The event began to take shape as guests started arriving. She helped guide them, offered programs, and ensured that everything ran smoothly. She noticed the attention to detail that the organizers gave to every aspect, the way the chairs were perfectly aligned, the gentle music playing in the background as people mingled, the carefully placed floral arrangements that added a touch of elegance. It was beautiful, almost magical, and she felt privileged just to be a part of it. Even in the shadows, as the audience settled in, she moved to her usual corner, where she could watch without being in the spotlight. She observed the performers taking the stage, each one confident and polished, their fingers gliding effortlessly over their instruments. She admired them silently, noting their precision, their expressions, the way they commanded the attention of the room. She wondered what it would feel like to stand there, to let the music pour out from within her, unrestricted and alive. The thought made her heart race, and she felt a spark of longing she could not ignore. Then, unexpectedly, a group of students approached her. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and amusement, and she sensed the challenge in their eyes. One of them, speaking with a hint of mockery, suggested, almost jokingly, that she play a simple tune on the grand piano. The words landed like a small stone in her chest. She hesitated, unsure if she had heard correctly. They seemed to expect her to refuse or fail, to provide them with a moment of entertainment at her expense. Her pulse quickened, and she felt a wave of nervousness. Yet beneath it, a small flame of determination flickered. She had spent years listening, learning, and imagining herself playing. Could this be the moment to step forward, even just slightly? She looked at the piano again, its polished surface reflecting the soft lights, and felt a strange connection. The idea of playing in front of an audience terrified her, yet it also thrilled her. She could feel the music waiting for her, patient and expectant, like an old friend who knew her better than anyone else. She knew that once she started, she would be carried by the notes, by the rhythm that had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. The students were watching her, their whispers fading into the background as she focused on the instrument. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the tremor in her hands. She reminded herself that she had practiced, in her own way, countless times. She had learned not from formal lessons, but from observation, from listening to the world around her. She knew the piano intimately, and it knew her. That silent understanding gave her a small but steady courage. She approached the piano slowly, each step deliberate. The audience was oblivious, immersed in their own conversations, unaware of the moment that was about to unfold. She seated herself on the bench, her fingers hovering above the keys. The wood was cool under her touch, and she felt a shiver of anticipation run through her body. She took another breath, closed her eyes briefly, and let the music fill her mind. It was as if the hall itself held its breath, waiting for her to begin. The first note she played was soft, tentative, almost hesitant. She listened to it, felt it vibrate through her, and then allowed herself to sink into the rhythm she knew so well. Her fingers moved with a confidence that surprised even her, guided by memory and emotion rather than formal training. The sound grew, filling the hall with a melody that was both delicate and powerful, capturing attention without demanding it. People turned, drawn by the unexpected beauty emerging from the grand piano. In that moment, she felt a shift. The nervousness melted away, replaced by a quiet exhilaration. She was no longer the girl who cleaned the halls, unnoticed and dismissed. She was a musician, a storyteller, someone who could speak through notes rather than words. Each chord, each delicate trill, carried a piece of her soul, and she could feel the audience responding, subtly at first, then more openly, leaning forward, listening. Captivated. Time seemed to stretch and compress at once. She played not for applause, not for recognition, but because it was the truth she had carried inside her for so long. The music was hers, yet it belonged to everyone in the hall now. She could feel the energy of the room, the way it resonated with her, creating a connection that words could never achieve. The mundane worries, the teasing comments, the doubts, they all faded, leaving only the purity of sound and the thrill of expression. And so, the day that began like any other transformed into something extraordinary. She had stepped into a world that had always felt out of reach, and in doing so, she had begun to write a new chapter of her life, one note at a time. She did not yet know how far this moment would take her, what doors it might open, or how it would change the way people saw her. All she knew was that for the first time in a long while, she felt completely alive, entirely herself, and ready for whatever the next note. The hall was buzzing with polite chatter, the kind you hear at formal events, where everyone is trying to appear more refined than they felt. She moved quietly along the edges, carrying a stack of programs in her hands, making sure she didn't get in anyone's way. Her eyes occasionally wandered over the polished wooden floor, the grand piano sitting near the front, like a throne waiting for someone to claim it. She knew her job was simple help, tidy things up, and keep the area organized, but somehow her heart was beating faster than usual. There was a sense in the air, something she couldn't quite name, a mixture of expectation and hidden judgment that she could feel pressing down, even though she had no real reason to notice it. From across the hall, a group of students she had seen before started whispering among themselves. They were well-dressed, confident, and laughing softly in a way that made it clear they were amused by something or someone. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on her work, placing programs neatly on the seats and making sure the stage looked presentable. But she could feel their eyes on her. It was subtle at first, just a glance or two, but gradually it became clear they were watching her every move. Then came the comment, the kind that was meant to sting, but she didn't quite understand it at first. One of them, leaning against the wall with an air of casual superiority, smirked and said loudly enough for her to hear, "Hey, why don't you play something on that piano? Maybe a simple tune? Something easy so you don't embarrass yourself." The words were dripping with sarcasm, meant to humiliate, to point out that she didn't belong here, that she was nothing more than a cleaner with no real talent, someone who should stay in the shadows. For a moment, she froze. Her fingers, which had been lightly brushing against the edges of the programs, tightened around the stack in her hands. She didn't know if she should be angry, ashamed, or just run away and hide somewhere. Her mind raced. She had always loved music, ever since she was little. She remembered sneaking into practice rooms at her old school, fingers trembling over the keys, as she tried to play pieces she had memorized from listening to older students. Music had always been a part of her life, but it had been a private thing, a secret joy she never shared, because she thought no one would take her seriously. And now, someone was daring her to perform, expecting her to fail. The group of students laughed softly, leaning closer to each other. "Yeah," another added, "let's see what she can do. Bet it won't be much." They clearly thought it was a joke, a way to entertain themselves by watching someone struggle. She could hear their laughter carrying across the hall, light and cutting, like a breeze brushing past without warmth. It made her stomach tighten, but somewhere deep inside, a small spark of determination flickered. She had felt this before, moments when someone underestimated her, and she knew she had more to give than they thought. She slowly walked toward the piano. each step measured, trying to ignore the whispers and snickers behind her. The polished wood gleamed under the bright lights, reflecting her own nervous face back at her. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment, and she could feel the weight of the room pressing down. People were staring now, some curious, some skeptical. The students who had mocked her were leaning forward slightly, ready to enjoy the spectacle of her failure. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind as she set her hands on the keys. She remembered the many nights she had spent practicing in secret. She remembered the way her fingers had stumbled over the notes at first, how her heart had raced every time she made a mistake, and how eventually, through patience and persistence, the music had started to flow naturally. She could feel that rhythm now, beneath her fingers, almost like an old friend greeting her. The fear didn't disappear completely, but it became something she could channel into focus. A few hesitant notes escaped, soft and careful, almost timid. She looked up briefly, catching the faint surprise on the faces of some of the audience members. They had not expected even this, a simple start that hinted at control and potential. Encouraged, she allowed herself to sink deeper into the music, letting her fingers remember the patterns she had practiced countless times in quiet, lonely rooms. Each note became more confident, more deliberate. The hall, which had been filled with chatter and laughter, gradually quieted as the music grew, drawing the attention of everyone present. The students who had mocked her at first exchanged uneasy glances. They had assumed she would fumble, that the simple tune would be just that, a weak and awkward performance. Instead, the notes began to flow with an unexpected richness. They were clear, expressive, and precise. Every phrase carried emotion, a story that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the surface. It was as if she had taken all the doubt, all the skepticism, and transformed it into something beautiful and undeniable. She became more absorbed in the music, almost forgetting the people around her. Her eyes followed the keys as if reading a secret language only she understood. The sound filled the hall, bouncing off the high ceilings and polished floors, reaching every corner where someone had been waiting to scoff. The notes were no longer timid. They were alive, expressive, and commanding attention without demanding it. People stopped talking, stopped moving, simply listening. There was a quiet awe in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that something extraordinary was happening right in front of them. Even the students who had whispered and snickered moments ago were beginning to shift in their seats. Some leaned forward, eyebrows raised, while others sat frozen, unsure of what to say. The laughter had vanished completely, replaced by a hushed curiosity, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. The music was enough to carry her beyond fear, beyond doubt. It was a private conversation made public, one that revealed her skill, her heart, and her quiet dedication. She played for what felt like both an eternity and a fleeting moment at the same time. Each note built upon the last, forming a pattern of emotion and technique that had been honed in secrecy for years. She remembered the times she had doubted herself, the moments she had almost given up, and yet here she was, proving not to anyone else, but to herself, that she belonged in this space, that her passion and talent were real. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the hall remained silent for a heartbeat. It was the kind of silence that comes after something unexpected, the pause before realization sinks in. Then, gradually, a ripple of applause began, small at first, uncertain, and then growing steadily, building into a wave of recognition that filled the room. The students who had mocked her moments ago could only stare, caught between surprise and admiration. The music had transformed their skepticism into respect, if only for a moment, and the weight of their judgment seemed to evaporate under the warmth of genuine talent. She exhaled, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the final notes still echoing in the air. A small smile appeared on her face, not from triumph over others, but from the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had faced the challenge and risen above it. The fear, the doubt, the mockery, all of it had been real, but it had not been enough to stop her. She had done what she had come to do, even if it had begun as a cruel joke. From somewhere near the back of the hall, a teacher approached, clapping softly, eyes filled with genuine admiration. Others soon followed, nodding, whispering to one another about the unexpected performance. It was not just the skill that impressed them. It was the courage, the grace under pressure, the willingness to step forward when all eyes were on her. She felt a mixture of relief and pride, her hands still tingling from the effort, her mind buzzing with the realization that she had shown something important, not just her ability to play, but her determination to rise above doubt and judgment. Even the students who had mocked her began to shift, some offering tentative smiles, others simply looking away, perhaps unsure of how to process what they had witnessed. It was a moment that would linger in the hall long after she stepped away from the piano, a memory of unexpected brilliance, a reminder that talent and heart often emerge in the most surprising places. She straightened up, smoothing her clothes, and allowed herself a small, quiet sigh. No one needed to tell her that she had succeeded. The sound of applause, the appreciative glances, and the lingering energy in the room were proof enough. She had walked in as someone overlooked, underestimated, and laughed at, but she was leaving, or at least stepping back, as someone who had touched the hearts of those around her, someone who had reminded everyone that talent cannot be measured by appearance, position, or expectation. As she returned to the edge of the hall, the group of students who had mocked her fell silent. Some avoided her gaze, others seemed lost for words. It was not a punishment or revenge, but a simple recognition of truth. She had something special, something that could not be ignored. And in that moment, she realized that perhaps the world was larger and more surprising than she had allowed herself to believe. Her heart still raced, but it was no longer from fear. It was excitement, anticipation for what might come next, and a deep, satisfying sense of pride that came from stepping forward, standing tall, and allowing her true self to be seen. The piano, now quiet, seemed. The applause had barely faded, and yet the warmth of it still lingered in the hall, wrapping around her like a gentle embrace. She moved back toward the edge of the room, her hands still tingling from the piano keys, her chest still rising and falling with the rhythm of the music that had just passed through her fingers. The room, once buzzing with chatter and skepticism, now carried a different energy, a quiet, almost reverent curiosity that seemed to follow her wherever she moved. Every step felt heavier, not because of fear, but because the moment had shifted. She was no longer invisible, no longer just a background presence. The eyes of everyone in the room were on her, and for the first time, she felt both the weight and the thrill of it. She had barely settled when someone came forward from the side. A faculty member she had seen before, but never spoken to. Their expression was a mixture of surprise and encouragement. "That was remarkable," they said softly, almost as if speaking the words out loud might shatter the magic of the moment. "Have you had formal training?" She shook her head, uncertain how to answer. It felt strange to admit that most of her learning had come from stolen moments, from listening and practicing in secret when no one was watching. The hall had always been her sanctuary, and now it had turned into a stage she had never sought to stand on. Yet somehow she had managed to command it. A few people in the audience began whispering among themselves, their voices hushed but urgent. The students who had been mocking her before now looked hesitant, unsure of how to react. Some avoided her gaze entirely, pretending to be occupied with programs or their phones, while others watched her quietly, perhaps trying to understand how someone they had dismissed so casually could possess such undeniable skill. She could feel the tension shift, the balance of judgment tipping subtly in her favor, though she didn't want to dwell on it. There was something else now, something more important to sense than her love for music. Her dedication had spoken louder than any words, louder than any expectation. She found a corner near the back and tried to steady her racing heart. The hall was no longer filled with laughter, but it was not entirely quiet either. There were murmurs of admiration, whispers of disbelief, and the occasional soft exclamation of praise. People were starting to see her differently, and she felt the strange mixture of embarrassment and pride that comes when you are suddenly at the center of attention. She had never wanted this kind of recognition, yet now that it was here, it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. A student she recognized from previous events approached cautiously, a faint smile on their face. "That was really good," they said, their tone hesitant, almost as if testing whether it was safe to compliment her. She nodded politely, her lips curving slightly into a small smile. "Thank you," she replied softly, her voice calm despite the whirlwind of emotions inside. It was strange to hear such words directed at her. Strange to realize that she was no longer just a background figure, but someone who could command attention with the simplest act of courage, touching the keys and letting the music speak for her. Her thoughts drifted back to the piano itself, the instrument that had become both a challenge and a refuge. It had been there, waiting, silent and polished, and she had brought it to life in a way no one had anticipated. The memory of her fingers moving across the keys, finding the notes with confidence and precision, made her smile again. It wasn't just the skill. It was the emotion, the way the music had flowed naturally from her heart. That connection, that ability to express herself so fully, was something she had always known existed, but had rarely shared. Now it had been witnessed, and the feeling was almost overwhelming in its intensity. As the murmurs continued, she noticed another group of students approaching from the other side of the hall. They were younger, perhaps not yet fully aware of the hierarchy and politics that often governed these events, but their eyes were bright with curiosity. One of them whispered to another, and she caught snippets of their conversation words, like talented, unexpected, and how did she do that, floated to her ears. It was strange to hear people talk about her in this way, to realize that her private passion had become public admiration. She felt a sense of responsibility now, a quiet pressure to live up to the sudden expectations that had been placed on her. Even though she had never asked for this spotlight, a soft rustle of papers drew her attention. She turned slightly to see a program falling from a nearby table. She stepped forward instinctively to pick it up, handing it to the person it belonged to with a polite smile. "Thank you," the person said, and there was a warmth in their voice, a subtle acknowledgement of her presence and her skill. It was not the laughter or mockery she had anticipated. It was genuine, human recognition, something that resonated far more deeply than she could have imagined. She took a few moments to breathe, letting the sound of the hall settle around her. The energy was different now, charged with a kind of respectful curiosity. People were no longer talking over one another. They were listening, observing, processing what they had just witnessed. Even the staff, who had been moving about efficiently, paused for a moment, glancing toward the piano with expressions of quiet admiration. It was a rare thing, she realized, for music to have such a palpable effect, to shift the atmosphere in a room so completely with nothing more than sound and emotion. Her mind wandered briefly to the students who had mocked her. She could still feel the sting of their words, the sharp edge of their sarcasm. But now it was tempered by something else, a realization that their expectations had been irrelevant. They had sought to define her ability, to set limits, and yet she had transcended them. The experience was liberating in a way she had not anticipated. It was not revenge, not a statement of superiority, but a quiet affirmation of her own worth, of her own skill and dedication, something that had always existed but had finally been seen. A soft cough drew her attention to the front of the hall. One of the teachers, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, had approached. She watched her for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully, and then said, "I would love to see more of your playing sometime. Have you considered formal lessons?" The question surprised her. Formal lessons had always seemed like a distant dream, something reserved for those who had been recognized early, who had been nurtured and supported in ways she had not. She shook her head slowly, unsure how to respond. The teacher smiled warmly. "You have real talent. Don't let it go unnoticed." Those words, simple as they were, carried a weight she had never felt before. It was encouragement, belief, and an invitation, all rolled into one. The students nearby had begun to gather in small clusters, talking quietly among themselves. Some were still processing what they had witnessed, while others were clearly trying to understand how someone so unassuming could produce such skill. She could hear fragments of conversation. "I didn't expect that. She's amazing. How long has she been practicing?" It was fascinating to observe, to see the curiosity and respect slowly replace the skepticism and mockery that had filled the room just moments ago. She realized that her presence had shifted the dynamics in ways she had not anticipated. The hall, which had once felt intimidating and alien, now felt strangely welcoming, as if the music had carved out a small space for her to belong. Her attention was drawn back to the piano. The polished surface reflected the bright lights overhead, and she could still feel the memory of the keys beneath her fingers. The music had been hers, yet it had also belonged to everyone who had listened. That duality was strange, powerful, and deeply moving. She realized that performance was not just about playing the right notes. It was about sharing something personal, allowing others to witness a piece of your soul. And in that moment, she understood that her love for music had always been more than a hobby. It was a bridge between herself and the world around her. She took a few steps away, adjusting her posture, trying to calm the mixture of excitement and nervousness that still bubbled inside her. She noticed a young boy near the edge of the hall, holding tightly onto the hand of an older relative. His eyes were wide, fixed on her as if he had just seen something magical. She offered him a small, encouraging smile, and he returned it shyly. The connection was brief, but it reinforced the strange, wonderful reality that had settled over the hall. Music had the power to create bonds, to touch hearts in ways words never could. The murmurs of admiration continued to grow. People who had been skeptical or indifferent were now discussing her quietly, some even coming closer to ask questions about her background and experience. It was a new world for her, one she had never expected to enter. Yet she felt a growing sense of confidence, a realization that perhaps this was only the beginning. Her journey with music had always been solitary, but now it was intersecting with the lives of others in ways she could never have imagined. Each glance, each whispered comment, each small act of recognition was a thread weaving her more firmly into the fabric of this community she had always observed from the edges. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where music was not just a secret passion, but a visible part of her life. The thought was thrilling, terrifying, and inspiring all at once. She knew there would be. The quiet hum of conversation slowly settled into a steady murmur as she walked closer to the piano once more. Something inside her had shifted during the brief moments after her first performance. The nervousness that had gripped her earlier had not disappeared entirely, but it had changed into something different, a flicker of determination, a sense that she was ready to embrace this unexpected moment and see where it could lead. She looked at the piano, its polished surface reflecting the lights above, and a strange sense of calm washed over her. It was waiting, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a companion. She felt the smooth wood under her fingertips, even before she touched the keys. And she realized that the music had become more than just a personal passion. It was a bridge, a way to connect with everyone in the room. The audience had shifted slightly, many of them still standing, quietly observing. The students who had mocked her before lingered near the back, their expressions uncertain. Some whispered among themselves, casting glances in her direction, trying to process the change in the energy around the room. There was curiosity now, a sense of wonder, and even admiration hiding behind cautious expressions. She could feel their skepticism, their lingering doubt, but she no longer cared. The focus that music demanded had settled over her like a warm cloak, shielding her from distraction and fear. She seated herself at the piano, allowing her fingers to hover just above the keys. The room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, there was only the silence and the faint scent of polished wood and fresh flowers arranged near the stage. Then, slowly, she pressed the first note. It was deliberate, confident, and it rang out clearly, cutting through the quiet like sunlight through a window. She didn't rush. She let each note find its place in the space, letting the melody breathe and expand. The hall responded instinctively. Conversations faded, heads turned, and eyes fixed on her, drawn by something invisible but undeniably powerful, the promise of a story unfolding through music. The tune began softly, delicate at first, as if testing the room, feeling its energy, sensing its mood. She allowed her fingers to follow the rhythm she felt in her mind, not simply the notes on the page, but the emotion behind each one. The music began to grow, subtle layers of harmony intertwining, creating a texture that seemed to pull at the very atmosphere. People in the audience leaned forward, some unconsciously swaying, others gripping the edges of their seats as though trying to hold themselves in place while the music took over. She could see the expressions change in the students who had doubted her, the sharp looks of anticipation blending into awe, disbelief melting into fascination. She had always played music for herself, private and quiet moments where she could escape into sound, where the world seemed to slow down and every note mattered. But now, as her fingers danced over the keys, she realized something remarkable. She was sharing that experience with dozens of people, and each person was taking a piece of it with them. The energy of the hall shifted subtly, from passive observation to active engagement. There was a current running through the audience, a connection that transcended age, background, or expectation. She could feel it, almost as a vibration under her fingertips, as if the piano in the hall had become one living, breathing entity, responding to every gentle touch and deliberate press. Her confidence grew with every phrase she played. The nervous hesitance of the first notes was gone, replaced with a steady, assured control. She could see the reactions of the audience without looking at them directly, the way they leaned in slightly. The quiet gasps at unexpected flourishes, the soft clapping of fingers on knees that gradually built into fuller, more expressive applause as she progressed. The music was no longer just notes arranged on a page. It had become a story, each phrase carrying its own weight, each chord a sentence in a narrative only she could tell. A few students who had whispered mockingly earlier tried to maintain their composure, but it was impossible. Their eyes betrayed them, widening in astonishment, brows furrowed in concentration, mouths opening slightly, as though trying to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. They had thought her talent was minimal, a small, laughable curiosity. Instead, she was filling the hall with a performance that was both technically impressive and emotionally compelling. The dichotomy stunned them. The quiet girl they had dismissed was commanding the room, and they could do nothing but watch. She paused briefly at a transitional chord, allowing the resonance to fill the space. That pause, though momentary, was profound. The room felt heavier, more intimate, as if every person present had been pulled closer into the story she was telling. She could sense the anticipation, the collective inhalation of breath that seemed to synchronize with the subtle vibrations of the piano. In that moment, she felt a profound connection, not just with the music, but with everyone who had dared to watch her. It was humbling and exhilarating at the same time, a reminder that music could be both personal and universal, a language that needed no translation. The next sequence of notes demanded agility and precision. She moved through them with deliberate focus, her fingers darting across the keys with practiced ease. The melody soared and dipped, building tension and releasing it in waves that seemed to resonate in the very bones of the listeners. The hall was silent except for the music itself. Every cough, shuffle, and whisper had vanished. People were caught in the spell of the performance, drawn into the ebb and flow of rhythm and harmony that seemed to narrate emotions words could never capture. Even the faculty members who had been observing from the side were leaning slightly forward, eyes glimmering with admiration. One whispered to another, "She's exceptional," and the comment carried not just acknowledgement of technical skill, but a recognition of the courage and heart that underpinned it. It was not just a display of talent. It was a revelation, a glimpse into a person who had spent years cultivating something quietly and privately, only now revealing it to the world in a way that left everyone astonished. She let her hands linger on the final chord of a phrase, feeling the vibration run through her fingertips. The music began to shift, moving from the intricate technical passages to something softer, more melodic, more introspective. Her mind recalled long nights spent practicing alone, fingers stumbling over difficult sequences, learning patience and resilience through repetition. Each note carried a memory, a moment of dedication that had gone unnoticed by others. Now, as she played, she realized that all those unseen hours had built a foundation, not just for skill, but for expression. The music she created was a culmination of every quiet struggle, every persistent effort, every moment when she had refused to give up. A soft smile appeared on her face as the melody swelled into a gentle crescendo. She could see the emotional impact on the audience. Eyes glistened with surprise and admiration, some moist with the quiet recognition of beauty. She did not play for their reactions, but the awareness that the music was touching others added a subtle layer of joy to her performance. It was strange to realize that her private journey, once hidden and personal, had found a shared space in the world. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and fulfilling all at once. The students who had mocked her now watched in stunned silence. Their earlier confidence had crumbled, replaced by awe and respect that they were unprepared for. Some whispered quietly to one another, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. One student finally muttered, "I never imagined." "She's incredible," as if the words were struggling to form because they could not quite contain the astonishment. She ignored them, focusing entirely on the music, letting the flow guide her through the intricate passages that now felt like extensions of her own thoughts and emotions. She began to play the climactic portion of the piece, a section that demanded both emotional depth and technical mastery. The notes cascaded like a waterfall, each one striking with clarity, purpose, and expression. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity, the audience caught in a shared moment of awe and wonder. The hall, previously a space of polite attention, now pulsed with energy, every listener suspended in the tension and release of the performance. It was as if the music had created a private world for them all, a space where judgment and expectation were irrelevant, replaced entirely by the purity of sound and emotion. As she moved through the final measures, her hands moved with fluid precision, almost as if guided by intuition rather than conscious thought. She felt herself becoming part of the music, not merely a performer, but a vessel for its expression. The room was alive, every note resonating in the walls, in the air, in the hearts of those who listened. She could feel the energy, the pulse of connection, the sense that something remarkable was occurring, something that would linger in memory long after the final chord had faded. When the last note rang out, there was a moment of absolute silence, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the hall, soft at first, and then building, growing into a wave of sound that seemed to lift her from her seat. The students who had once mocked her now clapped with genuine respect, some standing in awe, others still too stunned to move. Faculty members smiled, nodding in appreciation, and a few even approached from the SID. The applause slowly began to fade, replaced by a quiet murmur of voices that seemed almost hesitant, as if no one wanted to break the spell that had been created. She sat at the piano for a moment longer, letting the echoes of her last note settle in the hall. It was strange to realize how different the room felt now compared to when she had first walked in. Earlier, it had seemed vast, impersonal, and intimidating. Now, it felt almost alive, charged with the energy of the people who had listened, who had absorbed her music, who had been moved by something she had created from her heart. She lowered her hands slowly from the keys, feeling the lingering vibration of the piano beneath her fingertips. It was a sensation she had known many times before in practice rooms, but never so powerful. There it had been private, intimate, safe. Here it was public, shared, and it carried a weight she was only beginning to understand. She realized that her music had done more than fill the hall with sound. It had created an invisible bridge between herself and everyone present. In that moment, she understood that the power of performance was not in proving something to others, but in revealing a piece of oneself and trusting that others would recognize it. She rose slowly from the piano bench, adjusting her posture and smoothing the wrinkles in her clothes. Her heart was still racing, but now it was from excitement rather than fear. The murmurs of the audience were no longer uncertain or dismissive. They carried genuine admiration and curiosity. People who had been skeptical were now leaning forward, eager to speak, to ask questions, to understand how she had accomplished something so extraordinary. It was both humbling and thrilling. One of the faculty members stepped forward, a notebook in hand, their eyes bright with interest. That was an exceptional performance, they said, their voice warm and encouraging. Have you ever considered formal training? There is so much potential in what you can do, and it would be a waste to let it go unnoticed. She shook her head, a mixture of humility and surprise coloring her expression. She had never expected anyone to notice, much less encourage her to pursue something more serious. The idea of formal training had always seemed like a distant dream, one reserved for those born into opportunities she had never had. Yet now, standing in this hall, with her heart still pounding from the performance, she realized that it might actually be possible. Around her, the audience began to engage more actively. Some were standing now, moving closer to offer their congratulations. Others whispered among themselves, comparing notes, discussing the unexpected talent they had witnessed. Even the students who had mocked her before were beginning to approach with cautious admiration. Their previous confidence had been replaced by a mixture of curiosity, respect, and, in some cases, disbelief. It was a subtle shift, but it spoke volumes about the impact her performance had made. A young man who had been sitting near the front approached first, his hands slightly trembling. I just wanted to say that was incredible, he said quietly. I've never heard anyone play like that before, not like that. She nodded politely, her voice soft but genuine. Thank you, she replied. She could see the awe in his eyes, the way he tried to find words for something he could not fully explain. That was what made this moment so powerful. The music had said what words could not. And now people were grappling with the feelings it had stirred. As more people approached, offering their own congratulations or quietly remarking on the skill they had witnessed. She felt a strange mixture of pride and vulnerability. This attention was unfamiliar, and yet it was not overwhelming in the way she had feared. It was affirming, a validation of all the years of practice, all the quiet moments of dedication, all the times she had refused to give up, even when it seemed pointless. It was as if the room itself recognized her effort and was now reflecting it back at her, magnified through the eyes and hearts of the people around her. The group of students who had mocked her earlier lingered near the back, their expressions unreadable. She could feel their eyes on her, but she did not turn to meet them. Their judgment no longer mattered. What mattered was the quiet understanding that she had faced their doubt, their sarcasm, and had transformed it into something beautiful. They could witness her talent, but they could not diminish it. It was hers, undeniable and real, and for the first time, she felt free from the weight of their opinions. A few faculty members gathered closer, speaking in hushed tones. She caught fragments of their conversation words, like phenomenal, unexpected, rare talent. The recognition was not casual. It carried weight, a professional acknowledgement of skill and potential. One of them stepped forward, smiling warmly. "If you are willing, I would like to discuss opportunities for further training," they said. "There is a place for someone with your ability, and I believe you could achieve great things." The offer was humbling, almost surreal. She had never imagined that her quiet dedication, the countless hours spent practicing alone, would lead to this moment. And yet, here it was, tangible and real. The audience began to disperse slightly, though many lingered, still eager to speak with her, or simply to absorb the afterglow of the performance. Conversations that had once been filled with chatter and casual socializing were now thoughtful and reflective, punctuated by soft admiration. People were discussing not just the technical skill she had displayed, but the emotion, the heart behind the music, the courage it took to stand before them and share something so personal. It was a moment of genuine connection, one that reminded her of why she had loved music in the first place. A small child approached, holding the hand of an older relative. Their eyes were wide with wonder as they stared at her, captivated by the performance they had just witnessed. She bent slightly, offering a gentle smile. "Did you enjoy the music?" she asked softly. The child nodded enthusiastically, eyes shining. "It was amazing," they whispered. The simplicity of the comment, the purity of the admiration, struck her deeply. It was a reminder that the impact of her music extended beyond expectations, beyond judgment, touching people in ways she could never have predicted. As the hall gradually returned to its usual rhythm, she found a quiet corner to gather her thoughts. Her hands were still tingling from the piano, her heart still racing with adrenaline and excitement. She reflected on what had just occurred, the unexpected challenge, the mocking suggestion, and the transformation that had followed. The experience had been more than a performance. It had been a test of courage, a revelation of potential, and a reaffirmation of her love for music. She realized that the moment had shifted something inside her. No longer would she see herself as merely an observer or a background figure. She had proven to herself, and now to others, that she had a place, a voice, and a presence that mattered. The faculty member who had spoken earlier returned, accompanied by another, carrying papers and notebooks. "We would like to invite you to join our training program," one of them said. "You have the skill, and with guidance, you could go far. We want to support you." Her breath caught in her throat. The idea of structured lessons, formal mentorship, and professional development had always seemed out of reach. And now it was being offered sincerely, not as charity, but as recognition of her talent. She nodded slowly, a mixture of disbelief, excitement, and gratitude filling her chest. I would be honored," she said softly. The atmosphere around her seemed to lift even further, a sense of possibility now permeating every corner of the hall. People continued to speak quietly among themselves, their curiosity and admiration lingering like a gentle hum in the background. The students who had doubted her earlier had shifted from ridicule to awe, and even a few are now approaching cautiously, offering hesitant congratulations. She received each with a polite nod, feeling neither superiority nor vindication, only a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had done what she had come to do, and it had been enough. As she began to gather her things, a few younger students approached, shyly asking questions about the music, the pieces she had played, and her experience with the piano. She answered patiently, sharing small details about her practice and her love for music. The joy in their eyes, the excitement of discovering someone who had once been overlooked but now inspired admiration, filled her with a deep sense of purpose. It was a reminder that talent, when nurtured and shared, could create ripples far beyond the individual. The students who had initially mocked her were no longer laughing or whispering. Their expressions were a mixture of respect, curiosity, and in some cases, quiet shame. They had witnessed something they had not anticipated, and it was impossible to ignore. The room had shifted, and she had been the catalyst. It was a subtle victory, not born of confrontation or retaliation, but of quiet skill, courage, and authenticity. She stepped away from the piano, pausing to glance at the audience one last time. The hall had been transformed by her presence and her music, even if only temporarily. She realized that the impact of her performance would linger, not just in memory, but in the changed perceptions of those who had watched. For herself, it marked a turning point. A moment when she had confronted doubt and fear, embraced her passion fully, and emerged with a newfound confidence that could not be taken away. As she left the hall, the sense of accomplishment street. The days after the performance passed in a blur of new experiences, emotions, and realizations. She woke up each morning with a strange mix of excitement and nervous anticipation, her mind replaying the music, the applause, and the faces of those who had watched her play. Even the quiet moments felt different now. The world seemed more open, more welcoming, as if a door that had always been closed to her had finally been unlocked. She kept thinking about the invitation she had received from the faculty member, the offer of formal lessons, and the chance to explore her talent in a way she had never dared to imagine. She had spent years practicing alone, in hidden corners and empty practice rooms, letting her fingers learn the language of the piano while her heart absorbed the music silently. Music had been her companion, her escape, and her solace. Now, it was something more. It had become a bridge to the world, a way to connect with people in ways that words could never achieve. The thought of stepping fully into that world both thrilled and terrified her. She had always feared judgment, rejection, and failure, but she also realized that she could no longer allow those fears to define her. The first lesson she attended at the academy was a revelation. The room was filled with instruments, scores, and students who were skilled and passionate. She felt nervous at first, unsure how she would be received, but the moment she sat at the piano, a familiar sense of calm returned. Her fingers moved instinctively over the keys, recalling the rhythms, melodies, and emotions that had carried her through countless private hours of practice. The instructor watched closely, eyes wide with admiration, occasionally offering gentle guidance. It was different from playing alone. Here, her talent was nurtured, shaped, and refined, and she began to understand the depth of what she had been capable of all along. Each lesson was a journey. She learned not just technique, but the subtle nuances of expression, the way music could communicate the deepest emotions, and the discipline required to reach new heights. At times, it was frustrating, challenging, and exhausting. She would make mistakes, stumble over notes, and question herself. But the foundation she had built over years of private practice carried her through. With every session, she felt her confidence grow, not only as a musician, but as a person who had learned to trust in her own abilities. And dedication. Her relationships with others also began to change. The students who had once doubted her now treated her with respect, seeking her advice and sharing their own experiences. Some were inspired by her courage to step forward, to embrace her talent despite fear and mockery. She discovered that her story, though personal, had the power to encourage others to face their own insecurities, to pursue passions they had kept hidden. It was a humbling realization that by being true to herself, she could influence the lives of those around her in meaningful ways. The Academy began to offer her opportunities to perform in small recitals, giving her a chance to gradually step into the spotlight. Each performance brought its own set of challenges. The first few were nerve-wracking, and she struggled with anxiety before and during each piece. But as she played, she remembered the feeling of the hall where she had first astonished the audience, the quiet moment when all eyes were on her, the weight of expectation, and the thrill of sharing something deeply personal. With each note, she regained that sense of calm and focus, letting the music guide her and allow her emotions to flow naturally. Word of her talent began to spread beyond the walls of the Academy. Invitations arrived for small local events, and soon she was performing for audiences who had no prior connection to her. Each performance was unique, each audience different, but the effect was the same. People were moved, inspired, and captivated. She began to understand that her gift was not just about skill, it was about connection, about sharing a piece of herself in a way that could touch others' hearts. Despite the growing recognition, she remained grounded. She never forgot the journey that had brought her here, the countless hours of practice, the quiet nights alone in empty rooms, the fear of judgment, and the courage it had taken to step forward when challenged. Those experiences shaped her, instilling a sense of humility, empathy, and gratitude. She knew that talent alone was not enough. It was perseverance, heart, and authenticity that allowed her to thrive. Her family, who had always supported her quietly, began to see the fruits of her dedication. They were proud, not just of her skill, but of her courage, resilience, and growth. They watched her perform, sometimes with tears in their eyes, recognizing the journey she had undertaken and the person she had become. It was a shared triumph, a validation of years of quiet support, encouragement, and belief in her potential. As she continued to perform and grow, she also discovered the joy of teaching. Younger students would sometimes approach her for advice, eager to learn from someone who had once been overlooked and underestimated. She guided them patiently, sharing not just techniques, but the lessons she had learned about courage, perseverance, and believing in oneself. Teaching became another way to express herself, another avenue to connect and inspire. She realized that her impact extended beyond performance, that by nurturing others, she could create ripples of inspiration that would continue far beyond her own journey. Opportunities began to expand even further. Invitations to larger events, competitions, and collaborations started to arrive. Each new challenge brought excitement and nerves, but she approached them with the same mindset that had carried her through the first performance: focus, authenticity, and courage. She remembered the moment in the hall when her music had captured everyone's attention, and she carried that lesson forward. That true expression, rooted in passion and dedication, was always compelling. No matter the audience. With time, she became more confident, not just as a performer, but as a person who had learned to embrace challenges and face fear head-on. She realized that life, much like music, was composed of moments of tension and release, of quiet reflection and bold action. Her journey had been filled with obstacles, skepticism, and doubt, yet each one had prepared her for the moments of recognition and opportunity that followed. She had learned to trust in herself, her abilities, and her resilience, understanding that growth often comes from unexpected challenges. her story began to inspire others in ways she had never imagined. People shared her journey, highlighting her courage to step forward when doubted, her dedication to her craft, and the way she had transformed a moment meant to humiliate her into one of triumph. She received letters and messages from students, teachers, and strangers alike, expressing admiration and gratitude for the inspiration her journey had provided. The realization that her experience could encourage others filled her with a quiet sense of fulfillment, a confirmation that her struggles and dedication had meaning beyond her own achievements. Despite the growing recognition and opportunities, she remained true to herself. She continued to practice diligently, not for applause or accolades, but for the love of music itself. Each note, each phrase, each performance was a reflection of her passion, her heart, and her journey. She understood that while recognition was meaningful, the true reward lay in the act of creation, in the connection between herself, her instrument, and her audience. That understanding allowed her to remain humble, focused, and inspired, even as the world began to take notice of her extraordinary talent. Years later, she would look back on the first hall where she had been challenged to play a simple tune. What had seemed like a cruel joke had become the defining moment of her life. It had been the spark that revealed her talent, courage, and potential to herself and to the world. She had stepped forward despite fear, embraced her passion fully, and allowed her music to speak for her. The journey that followed had been filled with challenges, growth, and new opportunities, each one building on the lessons she had learned that day. The experience had taught her something even more profound, that talent alone was never enough. True success, fulfillment, and connection come from courage, persistence, and authenticity. By being true to herself, by trusting her abilities and her heart, she had created a life filled with purpose, joy, and meaningful impact. She had transformed a moment of doubt into one of triumph. And in doing so, she had discovered not only her potential as a musician, but her strength, resilience, and the power of following her passion. As she performed in halls and venues far larger than the first, each note carried the echoes of that initial moment, the fear, the challenge, and the thrill of overcoming doubt. Every performance was a reminder of where she had begun and a celebration of how far she had come. She played with confidence, grace, and emotion, knowing that her journey had shaped not only her skill, but her perspective, her empathy, and her understanding of what it truly meant to share something meaningful with others. And so, the girl who had once been overlooked, underestimated, and mocked had become a musician whose talent, courage, and heart inspired everyone who heard her. She had transformed fear into triumph, doubt into opportunity, and a simple dare into a life-changing journey. The applause, admiration, and recognition she received were all meaningful, but the greatest reward was the quiet knowledge that she had believed in herself, embraced her passion, and shared her.